Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about different kinds of methods of persuasion. So you probably already or have started to look into discussing about different kinds of persuasion speeches, looking at different types of persuasion. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on different, the two types of speeches will be problem solution and questions of fact, value, and policy. However, today I want to focus more on how do you get to persuade people and so forth. And this lesson is not only just for speeches, but it's through a whole host of different kinds of things. So when we think about persuasion, we think about it in those initial terms when we talked about the idea of the history of rhetoric. Aristotle defined persuasion as finding all of the available means of persuasion in any given situation. Specifically, any particular situation has specific means of persuasion. We're going to focus on what those kinds of means are. And so when we do that, we have to figure out that audiences, and especially when we have a mediated world today that's really bifurcated and diverse, we have to figure out that how can we persuade people with different attitudes and opinions, focusing on that specific target audience, and then also realizing all members of the audience, and what we mean by audience is we have, we sometimes have a universal audience and then we have a more fragmented one, is affected in some way, shape, or form. So when we're talking about methods of persuasion, this goes back to our discussion that we initially had when we were talking about the history of public speaking, how rhetoric is extremely important, and this goes back to the Aristotelian proofs of ethos, pathos, and logos. If you remember correctly, we talked about how Aristotle argued, and still to this day, that credibility, or ethos, is the fundamental, the most important method of persuasion. Because without credibility, a speaker is not going to be able to persuade their audience to convince them that their particular ideas are correct. Okay? So when we're talking about ethos, we're at the idea of credibility. There are three things that go with credibility. The idea of competence. When I introduce myself every semester, I talk about my background, I talk a little bit about research, all with the idea to demonstrate that I'm just not some bum off the street, that I do have the ability to kind of do this. The idea of character, certainly could take a look at somebody if someone, we automatically give a lot of character to teachers, to pastors, to people who are a lot of positions of authority, have embedded character items with them. We expect them that they will obey the law, that they're going to be good people in general. But you can also generate character if you've done good works in your life, if you have a reputation of being someone who's fair-minded. And of course, charisma can certainly determine the idea of credibility. If you think about, and a lot of times you have those things embedded, but for example, President Barack Obama, especially during the 2008 presidential campaign, really showed that he had a lot of charisma, and his public speaking was able to elevate him to a position when he had really only been in national office for 8 years prior to his becoming president in 2008. Public speaking, really, charisma can really have an important effect on the ability of someone to establish and increase their ethos. Okay? When we're talking about initial credibility as determined before the speech begins, we talked about already about how a lot of you already have that initial credibility. I already believe that you're the experts. You don't necessarily need to put in a credibility statement for your particular speeches, but I certainly understand if you do. Derived credibility occurs during the speech. This is where you start, the presentation in itself convinces you that you're right, or convinces you that you're correct. If you watch an infomercial, you might see, the before and after pictures of someone after they've been on a weight loss program, and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to get involved. You have that kind of credibility that's established. And then of course, terminal credibility, at the end, you are convinced that you need to go out and buy that new car, or you need to go out and try to save the whales, or whatever activity it might be. When we're talking about logos, we're talking about the idea of logic. Logic is appealing to that idea of rationality, resonance. A lot of times common sense can also go in with the idea of logic. It just sounds correct. I said in class before that I think a lot of the best ways to look at ethos, pathos, and logos is look in the marketing and advertising campaigns that we have. When a car company says, you can save $3,000 by just coming in and buying at this particular rate, or lower your interest rate for whatever reason on a car, on a house, whatever, it just makes logical sense that you do so. who wouldn't want to save money? That would be illogical, right? So logic, we appeal to those kinds of logic to move forward, okay? When we're talking about the different kinds of evidence that you use, one, we focus on the idea of facts, direct observation. Potentially, we might do an inference, if we, infer from some, that person has a neck tattoo, so they must automatically be a criminal or something like that. Now, obviously, that's a wide stereotype, but we make inferences all the time based upon a particular statement or something. They have a PhD. Well, automatically they must be smart, right? Or they must be an expert in that particular field, even though that's not necessarily true. Both types of evidence provide different kind of truth, depending on what kind of truth you're looking for. Comes from a specific witness to event. And without support, statements can be certainly controversial. So you need evidence when it comes to appeals with different kinds of logical arguments. Okay? An additional kind of evidence is the idea of statistics, comparing and contrasting different ideas. Again, go back to that example. If you are trying to buy your house and your interest rate is at 5% on a 30-year mortgage versus a 4%, it would probably just make sense to obviously go with, say, 4% because you save money in the long run. You compare the statistical analyses, or it's better to use one particular product than another because those items bear out and demonstrate that it's just it's better for you in the long run. Okay. An example. We talked a little bit about this when we were looking at different types of evidence in general, or how do you use different aspects of research. Certainly different kinds of examples. We talked about the different types: hypothetical, short, long, anecdotes, different kinds of examples. Illustrations, kind of a narrative that will add more drama and an emotional element. When we're talking about an illustration, we're really talking about an extended anecdote, probably that gives an idea. You tell a story about something, and that narrative kind of elucidates what specifically you're looking for. Okay? And the final thing that we're looking for is the idea of testimony. I already mentioned those examples, and I mentioned this in class before, that testimony, I think, can be one of the more powerful, combined with the idea of narrative. You see that all the time when you look at shows or commercials that focus on the idea of weight loss, or that focus on, just even watching things like HGTV or other shows where people are on there exposing their lives and saying, if we just bought this kind of house, our lives would be better. Or if we just exercised 30 minutes a day, we will lose 30 pounds over. Testimony has an incredible effect on people, whether it be a personal testimony, a testimony of a friend, a testimony you see on commercials. We often make judgments based upon the testimony certainly of others. Okay? When we're talking about different kinds of logical argument, we go through this notion of a guy by the name of Stephen Toulmin. Stephen Toulmin was a mathematician and a philosopher as well as a rhetorician. He created what is called the Toulmin model for looking at argument, and there are different components of that. I just want to focus really on the first kind of 3 or 4. One of the most important is the claim that you make. Specifically, what is the argument that you're trying to put forward? Okay, the data of good reasons. Okay, facts, evidence. Okay, the warrant. Okay, and the warrant is the connection between the claim and the data. And it's the narrative that you use to connect those things put together. Qualifiers, I think, are extremely important because sometimes we make qualifiers. I think this is probably true, where it may not be totally true. The idea of certitude is predominant in society, especially amongst our politicians. They're certain that things are going to happen. But we often will couch our arguments that something probably will happen because we're not totally sure of what's going to occur. So you can take a look at Toulmin's method even further. Different kinds of reasoning. You've got the idea of deductive. What you have here, the major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. That is what is known as a syllogism or an enthymeme. So the classic example that is used: Socrates is man, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That kind of combination. We often engage in those kinds of enthymematic or syllogistic kinds of reasoning all the time. We just don't call it that when we're trying to move forward. Inductive reasoning is where we go from something that's more specific to more general. That we take our personal experience and we say, well, it can work for everybody. That is quite true when you see those ads for get-rich-quick schemes or whatever it might be. You hear them on the radio. If it can work for me, then it can work for anybody. And then you can have a whole bunch of different kinds of cases that could work. Causal reasoning, the idea of something causes another. The idea of if there's smoke, there's fire. Or if you do this, then that will happen. If you drive drunk, then you will be pulled over or you will cause an accident. Which, a lot of that makes perfect sense, right? If you don't pay your bills, you will most likely be kicked out of your apartment, or you will lose your car, or whatever it might be. There is a cause and effect, certainly to the universe. And then, of course, reasoning from different kinds of analogies. Again, we talked a little bit about this in class when we talked about the different kinds of evidence. But when we're talking about reasoning from an analogy, we take something where we're comparing something to something else, and then we think about the implications for that. So, for example, I like to use a lot of political examples. One of the things that fascinates me about political discourse, which is my specialty, is the use of different kinds of historical analogies. So a lot of times people in political discourse will invoke what is called the Munich analogy. And the Munich analogy, for those of you who are not familiar, in 1938, the Prime Minister at the time of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, went to Adolf Hitler and basically got a pledge from Adolf Hitler that they weren't going to invade Czechoslovakia anymore, that they were done acquiring land, and he went home to Britain saying that he had created peace in our time. Within 6 months, Hitler had violated that agreement. He had marched into all of Czechoslovakia, taken over, and Neville Chamberlain looked like a total moron based upon that kind of agreement. This idea of if you have a Munich agreement, somebody is automatically going to break it. So whenever we have, for example, we had an agreement with the United States and Iran with regard to nuclear weapons and checking and so forth. A lot of people call this another Munich agreement from 1938, and the implications that come from that Iran is automatically going to break that. So we reason from analogy all the time, and that creates a variety of different kinds of conclusions and implications from that reasoning. Okay? When we talk about the idea of pathos, we talk about the idea of emotion. Emotion is used all the time. In fact, more and more evidence is demonstrating that we often respond more to emotion than we do to logic, which to me is unfortunate. But the idea we respond to the idea of somebody, a sob story. Or someone, whenever you walk, whenever I drive at home, I drive down a road and I often see somebody with signs saying homeless, hungry, anything helps, and so forth. And sometimes I will give, if I have $1 or something, I'll give to that person. That kind of pathos. Or the idea of pathos when we talked about the ASPCA commercial with Sarah McLachlan's song and the angel, those images on the screen, that kind of idea, that pathos. That idea of sadness and fear and anger that it generates, where we are convinced that we need to help out organizations like the ASPCA or Christian Children's Fund or whatever it might be in order to help those who are less fortunate than us. Okay? When we're talking about looking at persuasion, we can go from ethos, pathos, logos, and we can also look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do those different needs kind of satisfy different things that when we're taking a look at persuasion efforts, are they potentially meeting our needs? So there are 5 different levels. There's physiological needs, the idea of breathing, food, water, shelter. Safety and security, are you creating a safe environment for your family? Love and belonging. We all want to feel a sense of intimacy, a sense of connection. The idea of self-esteem, confidence, respect of others, and the idea of self-actualization, which is really, really difficult to achieve, but the idea that we're creative, accepting, that we have meaning for our lives, and it's purposeful in some way, shape, or form. We can often measure the different kinds of things that people are telling us, whether or not they are meeting these different kinds of needs. So if you are in a relationship, is your relationship meeting your your basic needs? I mean, it really wouldn't necessarily meet your physiological needs, but what about safety and security, love and belonging and self-esteem? If it's not, then you're probably not in a relationship you want to be with that person. If they're not enhancing your self-esteem, that's probably someone you don't want to be with. So when somebody says, "I love you," and then they turn around and tell you that you're this, that, and the other, and they criticize you, that's certainly not helping your self-esteem, and you have to wonder, and are you persuaded by their pledges of love and support and so forth? Okay? So when we're talking about organization, this can certainly be helpful when thinking about, and this really can go to problem solution, the idea of establishing the problem to the audience. Is it important to what you're looking at? When we talk about problem solution speeches, one of the things that we often want to do is we want to focus on a problem that matches what our audiences are, and since most of our audience are college students, then maybe we shouldn't be talking about problems with the larger economy. We should be focusing on things like credit card debt, or college student loans, or how to deal with stress, or whatever it might be. Put the strongest argument first, and also put one of your strongest at the end. Okay? Avoid weak, flawed arguments. If you have a weak or flawed argument, try to sandwich that in the middle, because that's where we often do that, especially if you're going to have three particular arguments in your speech. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about the idea of fallacious argumentation, which is one of my favorite things to study. Different kind of argumentation fallacies. I won't go over all of these. You can certainly look them up in your text. But just some things that we generate. The idea of a hasty generalization. If we find someone who has committed a crime and they're from a particular town, we might make a joke, well, all people from Bridgewater are like that, or Boston, or Minnesota, or whatever it might be. We need to stop them from coming to America, or stop them from committing crime. The slippery slope is an argument that is often used, and that's often used in a lot of, policy arguments. The big one in the public today is a lot of the idea of gay marriage. Well, if you allow gay people to marry, then other people, we're going to start wanting to marry animals, and we're going to want to marry more people, and we're going to have polygamy. And that may be the case, but it's this slippery slope argument that if you give a little bit, then all of these other things are going to happen. And there are times when certainly those things do occur, but slippery slope arguments are often fallacious kinds of argumentations when we're talking about the idea. Appealing to tradition, or saying, well, this is the way we've always done it. Well, sometimes the way that you've always done it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done today. Now, if it isn't broke, should you fix it? Not necessarily. However, appealing to tradition and just saying, well, this is the way we've always done it and it should be done that way. So, for example, at Harvard and MIT, they have a lot of these secret societies. And these secret societies are all male clubs. Well, a lot of those male clubs were opposed to a new policy put in by MIT and Harvard where they said that those clubs now have to integrate and have to now become co-ed. And the argument that they made, well, this has been a tradition for 100 and some odd years. If you do this, it's going to debase these secret societies and clubs at Harvard and MIT. And that appeal to tradition didn't work because it's now the 21st century and we need to come and put our thing, bring those items certainly into light and so forth. Again, you can go through these. The final one that I'll have is the ad hominem argument. That's where you appeal and someone's character. So, for example, if you try to take, some people don't like some people, I'll use Donald Trump for example. Donald Trump makes an argument and so forth about different kinds, and they will say, well, he's been married 3 times, so he shouldn't talk at all about family and tradition and marriage. Well, they're attacking as a character instead of looking at his particular appeal on marriage or family. And I honestly don't know if he has or has had any kinds of major appeals to those kinds of ideas. But it's when we take a look at somebody's character flaws, and we attack their character instead of actually focusing on what they're trying to put forward as an important kind of policy statement or an important kind of argument, and so forth. So of course, when we're talking about the different methods of persuasion, we want to focus on the idea of clear argumentation. We want to focus on the idea of clear evidence. We want to focus and build credibility and use ethical forms of pathos and ethical forms of logic and use, appeal to arguments that satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs and so forth. And all those things, if done properly, can certainly help you engage in the proper kinds of ethical persuasion that hopefully all of you will take from not only from this class, but you'll practice in all of your lives as you move forward in giving all kinds of different types of presentations.